All right, we're back, and it's COMP305. What did I say, lesson 5? It's supposed to be lesson 7. Anyways, I'll have to rename this thing. Week 7, lesson 7, part 1. And we're talking about today is a couple things. First of all, just as a reminder for those people who are not here, there's an exam tomorrow, right? We're going to do the exam for people who are in section 1, which is you guys, right? There's an exam first thing tomorrow at 4:30, if I'm not wrong, between 4:30 and 6:30. That's your exam, right? So when you guys come in, be ready. You're going to build something. There's going to be basically there's no true, false, multiple choice. It's all practical. So either you know it or you don't. It's all going to be based on the 2D stuff we've been doing. Things you won't have to do is you won't have to worry about things like line casting. You won't have to worry about things like platforming in general. I'm probably going to base it on some kind of 2D information. You're probably going to have to make something move. You're probably going to have to make something collide. You're probably going to have to take care of scoring. Okay, those kind of things, and maybe scenes. The way I'm going to break it down is by task. So you're going to have X number of tasks. Now think about a task taking, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If it takes me 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I got to, let's say if I double the time, right? That means you might have 3, maybe 4 tasks max to do in the time period. Why? You only have about an hour and a half. An hour and a half, right, for 3 or 4 tasks, depending on the complexity, is all you can possibly do. Right? Now, you might be able to finish earlier. You might be able to, I probably will gear the whole exam based on, as an example, 45 minutes. And if you can get it done in 45 minutes, see you later. I'm also going to do treat it like a bit of a game jam. So for people who are in each section, whoever finishes first will get 5% bonus. Okay, that's how I'm going to do it. Right? So if you know your stuff and you finish first, you're good. You can use your book. You can use your materials, anything that you've used already, all your code. If you have all your code from previous assignments and so on, you can use that. I'm going to supply you with the assets, so you're not going to have to download anything or install anything from the asset store. But pretty much for tomorrow, we're going to have a little bit of a game jam again for the exam, game jam exam for between 4:30 and 6:30. And then for the next group, section 2, they'll be having their exam between the next day between 10:30 and 12:30. So that's the exam.
When is it?
Tomorrow, 4:30 to 6:30, right? During a regular class time. Okay. So again, things to study. Study your colliders. Understand understand the whole event life cycle for Unity. You should understand those things. You should understand things about texturing, like understanding how to use textures, 2D textures. You know, those kind of things are important to understand. Basic movement, if you're going to move things around, you know, transforms, those kind of things, you should know how to do. Everything basically from our space shooter equivalent and, you know, side scroller tutorial and the stuff we've been doing, you should understand 2D, right? So again, exam tomorrow, 4:30 to 6:30. Okay, that's when it's going to be. All right, so what are we doing today? So because we're going to be starting on a new unit today, it's going to be 3D. So we're going to start off with Blender, right? So I would normally do Maya, but not everyone has access to Maya because of the computers that are in front of you. Some people, I'm in another room. So if I would ask you to fire up Blender for me, right? Because we're going to do some 3D modeling today, and this is a review of what we're doing with 3D. So I'm going to fire up Blender here. There we go. And if you notice, this is the opening scene of Blender. So please kick off Blender. I'll wait for you guys to get going. And I'll turn the lights down. You can kick off Blender too. Blender should be on the desktop in front of you. If you don't have access to it on your laptop, you can certainly download it. I'm at version 2.76, right? Because that's the version that is later. If you're using a laptop, you should, like as I mentioned to you before and kind of in the beginning, you really should have kind of a numeric keypad or access to a numeric keypad with Blender. It's a little easier. You don't have to. You can certainly do things through the menus, but just as a review. So when we look at Blender, for those people, if you remember, there are different there's a sidebar here that describes actions you can take on the object in front of you, right? There's also the animation window down here. We're not going to use that. Here on the right-hand side, you have a little bit of what is similar to what Unity has as an inspector on the right-hand side. And on the top corner here, you have the outliner. So you have the outliner here. You have kind of an inspector here, very similar to Unity. And here's your viewport. This is the viewport that we're going to be using to do stuff. When we first open Blender, the things that you see immediately are, and by the way, just a reminder, when we do Blender stuff, we do it with, we select objects with the right mouse button, right? The left mouse button doesn't select. The left mouse button just moves your three-dimensional cursor, right? The three-dimensional cursor, if you notice, if I zoom in here, and again, I'm just zooming into the cube, see this little area right here, that's the three-dimensional cursor, right? So as we zoom back out, you can tell that the manipulator arms here show us that we've got the cube selected, right? So this is the cube, we've got it selected, and I can move it around just the same as always. Take a look. So if I go like this, if I grab it from the green manipulator arm, I move it across the y-axis. If I grab it from the red manipulator arm, I move it across the x-axis. And in Blender, the z-axis is up, which is a little different than it is in Unity. We have to talk about the differences here, right? Again, if I was to pan around the scene or rotate around the scene, right, you can see that now I have an object that I'm moving up and down. It's the cube object. The primitive is what we like to call it, right? And right now we have it in object mode. There's different modes in Blender, as a reminder, right? This, when you're in object mode, and again, if you want to see what the mode is, I'm just going to bring up this window right here. So just going to kind of carry this window forward up here. Notice down here on the left-hand side, there's this thing called that says object mode here in Blender, right? Object mode means you can manipulate the object by changing its transform or rotating the object here in object mode. You can't do any sculpting or any kind of modeling in this mode. All you can do is move it around, right? So what you want to do is when you want to model, you want to get in from object mode into edit mode. And you can do that by pressing the tab key. So when I'm in the tab key, you notice that the object we've highlighted everything. That means we've selected the entire object here in edit mode. And from here, we can modify it. We're going to get back into object mode for a second. So object mode, tab key, edit mode, and back to object mode. And again, you can tell because right down here, it tells you what mode you're in. Okay? All right, so we're moving things around. This is Blender. And again, there's a couple things that are in the scene. I've rotated my scene. So if you notice, I'm just going to keep rotating my scene here. You notice that the red arm is the x-axis and the y arm is the green arm is the y-axis. Red arm and green arm. And then the blue arm here on the manipulator is the z-axis, right, which goes kind of up and down. There's three objects in the scene right now we can see. There's the cube, there's the camera, and there's the light source, which is a point lamp. That's what it is right now. And a point lamp illuminates everything equally. Now, why am I showing you this stuff? Because we're going to import today. One of the exercises we're going to do is we're going to import objects from Blender into Unity. That's what we're going to do, right? Because we can't always be using the asset store, and there's going to be we're going to want to create our assets, at least some of the simple ones in Blender, manipulate them, do a little bit of modeling, very minor, or import them from other sources into Blender, use them, then bring them into Unity. So there's a whole pipeline of bringing it from Blender to Unity, and then we can kind of create and have assets to use. Okay, so again, I've got my cube, and one of the things to notice is if I right-click onto it to select it, there are some additional objects here on the top right. You notice here's different selections you can make. These are almost like little tabs, right? And if I click the third tab from the right, I get to the material tab. This is the material tab, right? And if you notice, there's a material that's already been applied to this mesh model, right? And the material is just called material. Let's rename it. So we're going to rename the material. We're going to rename this to red, right? We're going to call it red. Right now, if you notice, it's not red, it's gray, right? But the way to get it to look red is if you look at the diffuse property of the material, red, that we have, the diffuse property is right here. If I click in here, I can pull this color wheel down so that the material turns red. Now, even though the material's red, if your 2D Performer demo will be completed later in the course. That's interesting. Sorry, got a text from somebody. So again, if you notice here that the 2D, the 3D object here, where we're looking at a material which is red, and if you notice, there's a specularity here, another channel here, a specular channel. There's two channels, diffuse channel and the specular channel. The diffuse channel is interesting. It has it gives us the matte value, the color value, and the specular channel is the reflectivity of the object, right? So if you notice, we see a preview here on the right-hand side where the reflectivity is, you can see the reflection right here, right? So if I zoom into this object, and depending on the light source, we're going to get a bit of reflectivity and even some shading. Speaking of shading, what we want to do with our games is use a different type of shading than we have than when we normally have. So let me just move in from Blender Render on the top here. There's different modes. From Blender Render, let's move into Blender Game. Right, so here's Blender Game. And we're going to press the N key. So if I press the N key, it brings up a numeric transform. And if I scroll down, you notice that under shading, it's multi-texture. You want to move away from multi-texture and hit GLSL. This is just a different kind of shading than we normally would have. Okay. Also, in this numeric transform, you notice that the location is numerically here. You can actually modify the X, Y, and Z coordinates here of this object. This is equivalent to seeing this in the inspector in Unity. You would see these kind of things: the location, rotation, and scale. Those three things, as an example. And also, we have dimensions, which is, it shows us right now that the dimensions is 2 by 2 by 2. So, and when we look at the units here in Blender, you see that there's a grid in Blender. Each unit is a Blender unit. Not so in Unity. In Unity, we use meters. All right, that's the unit that we use in Unity. So again, the challenge is, how do we get this object from Blender into Unity? And there's a couple ways to do that. So first, let's save this object, and I'm going to create a if you want to get everything from this project, I've already kind of put one up. If I go to github.com, and if I look at Centennial College, if you notice, I've already done this lesson 7, and in lesson 7, you can see that I've got a bunch of different objects here that we're going to look at. So later on, if you want to go look at these, I've got some of these things you can follow along with the cube. If you're not that great at doing that, or a maze, we're going to make a maze today, and there's also a plane. Okay, so we're going to get to that later on. But for now, let's take a look at this cube. So I want to get this cube, and I want to bring it into Blender, right? So how do I do this? Well, let's create a local folder. So make a local folder, a new folder here, that I'm going to call, we're just going to call it FBX Assets, right? This is our first-person shooter assets that we're going to create. Because again, this is our first day we're doing 3D, and our next project is going to be a first-person shooter, right? So in order for us to get that, we need to kind of have some assets to play with. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And what I want to do is I want to export or save my Blender file in this folder. How do I do that? So I go back to Blender, and I say File, Save. I choose the folder, so that would be under Desktop. And if I go to FBX Assets, that's the thing I'm calling it right now. And if instead of untitled, I want to type in the name of my asset, so I'm going to call this cube.blend. Right, so let's save this Blender file. And there it is, it's saved. So I've got this. So go back to desktop for a second. And if you notice, under FBX Assets, I have this cube.blend, right? So that's one file. Now, and most often the case, when we want to export assets from Blender into another program, for example, or even import assets into Blender, we want to use something called FBX Assets, right? Well, we can export this into FBX as opposed to just the .blend, which is the Blender proprietary type, all right? Well, it's not really proprietary, but it's Blender extension, .blend. So let's save this, let's export this now as an asset. So I'm going to say File, Export, and I'm going to choose FBX. right? That's just the type of asset that I'm exporting. Okay, so I need to, I'm targeting FPS assets, and now I'm going to call it cube.fbx. And if you notice on the left-hand side here, I've got some export options in Blender, where I have my an object that says selected objects. Am I selecting the whole object? What am I doing? So let's click selected objects, because all I want is my cube, and click export. This creates my file, and if I go back here, if you notice now I have two files, one called cube.blend and another one called cube.fbx. Okay, I'm going to share this stuff with you up on GitHub. So the first thing I'm going to do is locally, I'm going to go here. So let's go into desktop. And let's go into FBX Assets. And I'm going to say git init. So we're going to make an initialize a git repository here. We're going to say git add dot git commit -m, and we're going to add in an initial commit for this little project. Okay, cool. So I've got it. Let us set up a repository up on, on GitHub. I'm going to go here. I'm going to add a new repository, and it's got to be on the right place. And it's going to be FPS Assets, right? FPS Assets. That's the repository I'm going to make. I'm going to get my information from there. For example, the remote information, and from there, I'm going to add this remote into my repository, and then git push -u unconditional origin master, which is going to push all my assets up to you. So if you want to follow along and you're a little bit slower than I am, you can do that. I've just pushed it up to this repository up on Centennial College called, if I refresh, Centennial College /FPS assets. You can grab my first cube.blend and cube.fbx. Okay, cool. So I've got this. How do I bring it into Unity now? So now look what I'm running. I'm running Blender, I'm recording, and I'm going to run Unity now. Watch. Let's do this. So I'm going to get, here's Unity. And I'm going to make a new project, right? So a new project. And I'm going to call this new project COMP305, and then lesson 7. I don't know why I was thinking about lesson 5 earlier, but anyways, whatever. Lesson 7. Part 1, and we're going to call this section 1, right? Okay, we're going to create this project. Okay, so when Unity launches, right now, all we have here, I'm just going to reassess my windows here. Let's put this over here, and let's just pull this window so it's a little bigger. There we go. So this is my little window. Just reassign some of these things. There we go. I've got my game and my scene. If you notice, my scene is empty, but right now I'm doing a 3D scene in Unity for the first time as opposed to a 2D scene. Okay. Okay, let's create a couple of folders here, as we normally do, to set things up for the first time. Right. So first, I need to create a folder called Scenes, and I'll make another folder called scripts, because we're going to need some scripts for this one. We're going to make another folder, right? This folder is going to be called materials. We're going to make another folder called textures, another folder called prefabs, and another folder called animations. Right, so those are the materials we're going to have for a little project, right? So a bunch of little folders. Now I want to import my stuff from Blender, and I'm going to go into the textures, or sorry, one more thing. We have one more folder to make, models. I'm going to make a new folder called models. Just going to make a new model. We're going to import the model from Blender into here, right? So how do we do that? So I'm going to go back into my operating system. And if you notice, I've got two files here, cube.blend and cube.fbx. Let's try the cube.blend first, because Unity has the ability to take in Blender files natively. It doesn't have to, you don't have to use FBX. It likes FBX better, but it does take blend. So let me just drag and drop the blend file right here into the model. And after a second, it imports the blend file. And if you notice now, I have a new cube model right here that I got. If I pull this cube prefab into the scene, I have a red cube. Take a look. Right, so I get a red cube. And you might say, well, that's not exciting, Tom. And I know it isn't, but that's okay because there's a couple of things to notice here, right? This cube is not your regular cube. Okay, let me show you the differences here. On the right, you notice how we have an animator that's already automatically been added into my cube, right? Don't need an animator for my cube typically, right? I also don't have a any kind of collider or anything like that, okay? Because I haven't, I don't have that. If I go back into my models and click on materials, I notice that I have the red material. This is the same material that I got in from Blender. And I can change this shader type from standard to standard with specular, which is what I need. So I have a specular set up here in Blender, right? So I've got a little bit of shininess to my cube, depending on my lighting. Now, here's something that you can't see. If I click on my camera, right, you notice how I can see my cube, right? Well, let me pull out so I can show you what I'm talking about here. If I rotate around the scene by pressing Alt, if I'm not wrong, on the and hold Alt down and pan with the mouse, or with the on the Mac, it's Option. So if you notice here, you can see that my cube is sitting inside of the view of my camera. There's my camera. Take a look, guys. And inside there, there's my cube. Right? It's floating inside the middle. And that's why here, this little mini preview down here shows me my cube. If I move my camera closer, my cube gets a little bigger. And if I play the scene, right, this is what I see in my cube. It's just like flat, right? If I look at it from a different angle, so if I move over on this side, as an example, I kind of move my camera away, or if I move my cube into the view, then I can see that I'm going to get a different view from my cube than I got before. So my cube is physically in my scene in 3D. We're playing it a little differently this time and for a couple of reasons. One, when we're playing, and by the way, I have maximize on play. That's why I'm getting maximal size. Take a look. So if I click this, now it's this big, right? So because maximize on play is on. Okay, couple things to note though. Before our main camera was in orthographic mode, right? Right now we're looking at it in perspective mode, which is like 3D mode. Okay, so that's kind of one thing we have to notice. And our cube is physically sitting here. Okay, let me click on my cube, and if you notice, let me just reset it so that it's in the original home position, right? So I'm going to reset it. Here it is, and let's take a look. If I add in a primitive in Blender and in Unity, like a regular cube, a 3D cube, what it looks like in comparison. And I want to talk about this with you guys for a second. So here's a cube I brought in from Blender. I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to click 3D Object and click Cube, and then I'm going to drag it out, and lo and behold, it's half the size. Take a look. How come? Blender, this one, Unity, half the size, right? Well, remember, there's a couple things, right? We never changed the units in Blender from Blender units to meters, right? And so Unity doesn't know what to do with it. Okay, one more challenge to do here. By the way, I don't know why I kind of included everything into one, but we're going to get rid of them for a second. I'm also going to go here into models and get rid of the materials for a second and start over for those people who didn't see that very quickly. And I want to use, instead of my blend file this time, I'm going to go back to my operating system. I'm going to drag in my FBX file to see what the difference is. Right, this is a different format. So I'm going to drag this in and into the models folder, and it's done. There's no conversion. It's already in the nice format it needs. But there's a difference. If I drag in the cube, you notice how I do get the cube, right? And if I was to reset its position, and let's just focus on where the cube is. There it is. By using frame select mode, the cube is very small. It's so small, in fact, that my camera has a real hard time looking at it. Let me show you the difference if I added in a regular cube. So I'm going to add in a regular 3D cube. Here's my cube. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. There's my regular cube, and can you see my other cube? No, because it's so goddamn small. It's like really small. I got to focus right in there. Why is that? Because the way Blender works is it tries to convert to the nearest compatible unit, and I haven't told it to go into meters or whatever. In Maya, you have a lot more control. you were going to go from Maya into Unity, there's a really good workflow. Maya uses meters as well. And so when you move from Maya into Blender or into Unity, you're good to go. Blender uses Blender units, so you have to convert. Let's go back to Blender and see what we can do to fix it. We got to do this piece first before we move into the next piece, because you have to understand what it takes to convert stuff. Okay, so here's my cube, but you know what I need to do? I need to do a couple things. First of all, notice my dimensions are 2 by 2 by 2. That's the first thing to notice. Let's move that into 1 by 1 by 1. So I'm going to go 1 by 1 by 1. So I'm going to make a 1 by 1 by 1 object, like 1 unit. That's what that is. Okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is, I also want to go to the third tab from the left here in the inspector equivalent, right? There's my properties, right? And if you notice, there's a section down here that says units. I can change my Blender units from none, which are regular Blender units, into metric. Now, if you notice, my cube's dimensions are 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter with a scale of 0.5. The reason why it's scaled at 0.5 or half is because my normal dimensions for an object is 2 meters, right, in Blender. That's just the way it is. Okay, so I've got my object. It's 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. I've changed my scale. I'm going to save my .blend file now. I'm going to save right over that one, yes. And I'm also going to save my FBX file. So I'm going to say export, right, to FBX. I'm going to click on my object. I'm going to click on this one. So cube.fbx and click export. And now I've exported my new files. All right, let's do a couple things here. Let's check to see when they're done. So I'm just doing kind of an ls minus al, right? And here I can notice that time that I've exported them, it's exactly 7 o'clock here at my time. So I've exported both my blend file and my FBX file. Those are the two new files that I've got here in my folder. That means they've been updated with the new information, the meters, as opposed to units. And I've changed the size of my cube to 1 by 1 by 1. Let's see what that does on the Unity side. So I'm going to go back to Unity, right? I'm going to get rid of some of these materials. So I want to try this again. Delete it. And what I want to do is I want to pull this from the operating system. I'm going to pull the .blend file in first and see what happens. So here's the .blend file. It does its little conversion dance. And I get a bunch of stuff, a cube, some materials. I'm going to bring my cube in. Oh, let me go back first. Let's kill some of this stuff because I don't need any of this right now. Just get rid of it. And let's bring my new stuff in. So here's my new cube. Yay. All right, let's take a look. My scale is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, just like it was in Blender, as an example. And when I bring in a new cube, so I'm going to say, as an example, I'm going to create a 3D object cube, and I pull it out. You can see now that it is the exact same size, pretty much, as the Blender cube. Okay, so both cubes are the same. And this is an important thing because now I've switched scale, right, so that both objects, both the Blender object and this cube that comes from Unity are the exact same scale. I need to do this when I import stuff from Blender into Unity, right? So that way we have like for like. Otherwise, the objects you build in Blender are going to be oversized or undersized compared to Unity. And then that would not be good. You're going to spend more time bringing them in than actually using them, which is not what we want to do. We don't want to do too much with Blender, right? Blender is just a tool to help us sculpt things or to bring in some stuff. We want to do most things in Unity in this course. Okay, so we've got our cube. Let's get back and get rid of those two things one more time and check out what the difference is between this form of importing and the FBX. So we're going to get rid of this. Yes, goodbye. And kill my materials as well. There we go. And let's use the FBX now. See what the difference is. So here's my FBX file, cube.fbx, and bring this into my models folder. Yay. Okay, so I've got my cube. I bring it in. It looks like a regular cube. It's also, now look at this. Scale is 49 by 49 by 50. It's massive, right? So now, but if I, at the same time, if I was to bring in a normal cube. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to 3D object cube. You notice again it's the same size, but my cube has been scaled up 50 times. Now this could have a dramatic effect on things that you bring in. So I highly recommend you use the .blend method in this way. It's a lot easier. It's a drag and drop. It's native in Unity, and we're good to go. Okay. All right, so let's just get rid of these things and go back to Blender. Just wanted to show you that. So you've got the cube. What I want to do now is I want to create a plane in Blender instead of a cube. So we're going back to Blender. I'm going to start up a new project. So I'm going to go File, New, and then restart the startup file right here. And if you notice, I start off with a cube, and I want to get rid of it. And I get rid of it by pressing the X button. So that my cube is now gone. There's nothing in the scene. I've got my lights, and sorry, my light and my camera. But right now, I'm gonna hide those two things. So I don't care about them. All I want to do is just get this another plane in here. And I want to change it from Blender Render to Blender Game. I want to do some prep. I want to press the N button, and I want to go into Numeric Transform and scroll all the way down to where it says Shading, and click from Multi-Texture. I want to click into GLSL. There it is. Now GLSL mode's on. I want to go into my Scene tab, the Scene tab here, and change from my units from none to metric before I add a new unit in, a new object, right? Those two things I want to do, right? Okay, and now I want to add a new object. Now when I add the plane this time, I want to add a plane, I do it like this. I press Shift A, where it says Mesh, I want to add a plane. That's what I'm doing here. And right now, if I scroll in, you can see that my plane is flat, right here. And I want to increase its size. Notice how the size of my plane is 2 by 2 by 0, right? It's completely flat. I want to make it, 16 by 16 by 0. Let's change the size manually here. So I'm going to say 16 meters by 16 meters by 0. And if you notice, it takes up most of my grid. My plane is quite large. I'm also going to rotate my screen so I can see the x-axis here on the right and the y-axis here on the top, with the z-axis going up and down. Right? This is the orientation I want. Okay. Okay, cool. So I've got my plane, and I want to do something to it now. This is not enough. I mean, the plane's pretty boring. Let's cut it up. Right, because this is one of the steps we need to take. So I want to go into tab mode, so tab into edit mode. You notice when I click the tab button, it becomes completely selected, right? And now on the left-hand side of the screen in Blender, on the sidebar here, you notice that there is a subdivide button, the subdivide button. If you click the subdivide button, you notice how this plane has been subdivided into 4 little squares. I want to continue to do that till I have 10 cuts. So watch, I'm going to cut. I'm going to keep on the left here. You can see I can change the number of cuts. I can do it this way. I can just type the number 10 and press enter. And I have these 10 cuts in here. That means there's 11 little squares this way and up and across. So 11 cuts, or 11 total squares, either way, 11 by 11 grid. Okay, cool. So I've got these cuts and everything else. And I need to add some kind of material, right? So I'm gonna kind of scroll over until I see the material button, right? There it is. And you notice now that on the right-hand side, I'm just gonna press the N button here for a second just to get rid of this Numeric Transform to give us more room. On the right here, you notice that the fourth tab from the right is the material button. When I click on this material tab, I can add a new material to my object. So I'm going to click New. And I still want diffuse material, but my specularity, instead of it being like shiny like this for this object, I want to turn it right down to nothing. So whoop, because I don't want my ground, this is what this is going to represent, I don't want my ground being shiny, right? So I'm going to kind of, in my outliner, I'm going to just rename my plane here, which I didn't do this morning, to ground by double clicking. And I want to change my material name, because my material name right now is just material 001. I'm going to rename this thing to ground as well, a ground material. We're going to keep it gray for a reason, because eventually later on I'm going to use a UV map to change the material so it looks like stone, right? For now, it's going to just look purely gray like this, right? Okay, cool. So I've got my material, right? My ground. I've got my plane, which is now called ground. I just renamed it. And I'm going to go back into object mode by pressing tab. And it looks like object is exactly the same as before. You can't tell that there's been cuts that have been made, right? And that's okay. Now I want to export this object into Unity. So we're doing the same thing. We're going to say File, Save As. We're going to change the name of this object from untitled to Plane, because that's what we're adding in. Plane.blend. And we're going to save this as a Blender file. And just for good measure, I'm going to export this as an FBX. I'm going to export FBX. And I'm going to go into down here, make sure that my selected objects are the ones that I'm going to export, right? And I'm going to click Export FBX, because this is where it's going to go. So I've got these two files now, and if I go back into my operating system, I can see that not only do I have a plane that's blend, but I also have my plane FBX file. Let's update those. I'll kind of send those up to GitHub for you. So I'm going to say git add dot git commit -m added plane. Okay, so that we've done that. Git push origin master. So now you have the plane and the cube that are up on Blender, up on GitHub. So you don't have to, if I'm going too fast, you can have those two objects. Okay, cool. So you've got these two objects. I want to bring them into Unity. We'll do it the same way. So I'm going to bring up Unity, and I'm going to bring up the operating system, and I'm going to drag and drop my plane.blend file into my models folder. It's going to take a second, and if you notice, after it converts everything, I have a plane model, which is called ground. Actually, the mesh is a ground mesh, right? And I also have some materials, and in my materials, I have a default ground material that looks kind of like this. I want to make it, instead of standard, I want to hit standard with specular setup, which means it's going to have that specularity that's very, very dull, right? So there shouldn't be any specularity here at all. We're going to get to this in a bit, right? And I can choose, right now, I can choose different assets to assist us as well. But for now, we'll leave it as is, right? And what I want to do is I want to drag and drop this model onto my scene. So I'm going to take this model here, drag it into my scene. And now you can see that the ground is here. But instead of it being 16 by 16 by 1, it's 8 by 8 by 1, because remember that typically my object is a 2 by 2 flat object. And this is just multiplying it by 8 to make it 16 meters by 16 meters. Notice that my rotation is -90 because, and if I click on my model or my mesh, you can see that it's standing up this way. Because in Blender, it's got a different orientation that we have in Unity. And so that way, the plane shows off to be kind of this, you know, it's oriented in a different way, like this, up and down. Okay, yeah.
That's not a blend file, right?
It's from the blend file. If I do it the other way around, let me just remove this thing. So I'm going to go back to models and remove everything, and I'll show you what it looks like when I use the FBX file. So I'm going to get rid of this, get rid of the plane that's been added in. It's an empty object, and we'll do the same thing with the FBX and see what the difference is. So here's my plane FBX. I'm going to move it in to my models, and when I do that, I get the same thing, except when I pass my plane into my scene, it's 800 by 800 by 100. It's massively scaled upwards to match what my requirements are. Again, it does what we need to do, but it's far, far easier and very much closer to use the .blend file, which is native to Unity. It accepts it native, and it does its conversion on its own. So I recommend that way as opposed to using FBX from Blender. Again, if you're going from Maya to Unity, FBX is the way to go, and you have a lot more options in Maya on how to do that. And this, by the way, by no means is this the only way to import objects into Unity and the way to do it. This is just the way I'm choosing to do it and show you right now. There's different ways, and there's other ways to do it that are maybe better. Okay, So we've got our plane, but it's kind of boring, right? We want to do something with this thing. We want to bring it in, and we want to do things with this thing. We want to actually, create a first-person shooter with this thing, right? Okay. So let's get back. We'll delete these objects here, and then we'll reorganize. So we'll delete them. Get rid of the plane. And I'm going to bring in my plane again from my blend file. So I'm going to get my plane from my blend file, drag and drop it into models. Right? It's going to do the little conversion dance. I've got my plane. And in my materials folder, I have ground. I'm going to take it out of there, and I'm going to put it into my materials folder in my assets. Because I've created a materials folder in my root. I want to put everything in there. So I'm going to take my ground material and pull it in there for now. Okay. I'm going to get rid of my extra materials folder that Unity got from Blender. I'm going to get rid of that. And now I have in my plane, I have a couple things. I have a mesh. I also have a clip, a movie clip, and I have an avatar. I don't need any of those things. So let me just bring in my mesh inside my scene for a second. Here's my mesh. That's my model. And if you notice in here, I have an animator, right? I have an animator as well as a mesh renderer. There's my mesh renderer. Here's my animator. Okay, so just to show you how this works. And I'm going to get rid of my animator because I won't need it. So get rid of that, which means I don't need my default take, which is the animation, or the plane avatar. I can get rid of those two things. Get rid of them. But if you notice, this is how this thing works. Now, I want to create this as a prefab, right? Because if it's a plane, I can use this thing as a platform or whatever. I'm going to rename this thing as a platform. So let's rename it. So from plane, we can call it ground or platform. Let's call it, actually maybe ground was what we originally had called it. So we'll rename it ground. I'm going to drag and drop this into my prefabs folder. So when I do that, it becomes a prefab, which is ground. Different than what my model was. My model has a different little symbol in front of it, if you notice. If I go back to models, you see how it has a little hierarchy underneath it. It comes with a default take, a plane avatar, and other things. I mean, I don't need these things. I can try and delete them again, but they won't delete for a couple of reasons. One is because my ground is physically in the scene. If I delete the ground from the scene and I try and delete them, right, they still don't quite delete because this is part of my mesh that I've imported, right? It's just things to note. So you got extra information here. All right, if I go back to prefabs, drag my ground back onto the scene, here it is, and it's just a regular plane. That's all it is right now. If I was to right-click here and add in another 3D object, which is a plane that's built into Unity, right? You're going to see how by default, and I don't know why it appeared that way. Let me just undo. I made it as part of the ground. Let's do that again. 3D object plane, so it's not part of the ground. There it is. And if I pull it up, it's actually half the size, right? It's like, 1 by 1 by 1. If I was to make this thing 2 by 2 by 2, right, then it's going to be closer to what I want. Right? You notice how the plane from Unity, right, is actually larger than the plane from Blender. And you can see how it's casting shadows. One is casting shadows on another, right? There's different objects here. Why is that? Because my ground, my default plane size is actually quite large. It's not the same size as a regular block. It's actually big on its own. If I go back to 1 by 1, it's actually almost 2/3 of the size, right? If I want to match it up to what we get from Blender. All right, so it's pretty big already, right? It's not like Blender. Blender gives you like one unit plane. This one doesn't do that. Okay, we don't need this extra plane here from Unity. I just wanted to show you so we can compare. So this is the plane, but if you notice, we can't really do anything with it, right? It's just a bare plane. We'd have to add in colliders and all this other stuff that we normally would do in order for us to use this thing. Like you look at all we have is a mesh renderer and right now a material. That's it. Okay, so we need to do more with this thing for us to make it useful. Okay, so we're going to get rid of it. We might use it later on in our scene. But again, this exercise, this piece here is how do we bring stuff in from Unity from Blender into Unity as a pipeline. How do we create a pipeline of meshes that we bring in? Because we're going to have to do that as instead of always using the asset store. The asset store is neat, but we need to make some custom materials. We're going to do that in a bit as well. Let's go back to Blender for a second. Okay, so I've got this object here, this ground, right? And this is where I want to start making an object out of this ground. How do I do that? I'm going to press Tab. I'm going to go back into edit mode, right? And if I zoom in here, right, you notice that there's little cuts. I don't know if you guys can see this on the thing, but there's these little divisions here, right? Well, if I go Control Tab, I can choose. Remember, there's three things that all three-dimensional objects have: vertices, edges, and faces, right? I'm going to go into face select mode, and if you notice when I do that, there's a little dot. It's kind of hard to see here. If I was to go into wireframe mode, if I press the Z key, you notice here that if I'm in wireframe mode now, and you can see that the dots, see the little dots here? These little dots show the faces that are selected, right? I'm going to go back into solid mode for a second. Okay, so I need to select some of these things. I'm going to deselect all first. I'm going to say press A for deselect all. If you notice these little dots all over the place, right? Okay, I'm going to right click. Let's do it together. I'm going to make a maze out of this thing. So watch me carefully. If you don't have this, if you're not up to speed with me, I'll do this again. I don't mind. But this is what you do. I'm going to right click on the first one. And then I'm going to shift right click, 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 shift right click. Okay, now I've selected these planes, these little subdivisions here on my plane. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to go shift right click without deselecting these ones. Shift right click, shift right click, shift right click, shift right click. To kind of create almost like a little path over here, right? If you notice. Now right now it's all flat, but you're going to see what we're going to do. Okay, we're going to make another little room. So we're going to go shift right click, 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 shift right click. Woof. And another one. There we go. And maybe a couple more for good measure. How about that? There it is. Okay, so let's continue. So we're going to make another little area here. So we're going to go here, a little bit of a block, and maybe a little pillar over here, right? And as we move down the line and rotate, all right, so I'm going to kind of rotate in. I'm going to continue to shift right click without deselecting everything. If you click anything else right now, it'll deselect. So just keep shift right clicking. Shift right click, shift right click, shift right click, shift right click. Okay, cool. And let's make a little division here between the rooms, right? And maybe make another room over here. This time I'll make it so that this center area is a little tighter. And maybe make it so that this room here kind of comes up this way with kind of an exit there. Okay, cool. So we've got this piece. Looks like a pretty simple grid, right? Now, without deselecting everything, I want you to press the E key, right? What this does is it extrudes these things upwards like this. Take a look, right? Now what we want to do is we want to move this up so that it's approximately 3 meters. Now, if you were to press the N key beforehand, you could do that. But if you notice on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, which is right here, bottom right-hand corner of the screen, it shows you how many meters the actual thing is right here, right? On the bottom left-hand corner. So I'm gonna pull my mouse there so you can see it. Don't worry what's gonna happen here. But on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen, over here, you can see that that's over here near the bottom. You can see that the meter count is there, right? Well, I want to bring it up to 3 meters approximately, just by eye, right? So bring up 3 meters, and that's probably around 3 meters right there. There we go. And I'm gonna left click. Huh? Okay, I'll undo that. Let's do that again. So undo, right? So I'm going to press, again, if you notice on the left-hand side, it's going to come up. Just to make it easier for you guys to see, I'm going to kind of, before I do that, I'm going to press the N button to bring up my numeric transform. And if you notice on the top right, the Z transformation is 0, right? I'm going to press the E key for extrude. I'm going to bring it up, which limits it. Okay, if you notice on the top right corner now, in the Z transform on the top right corner, it shows you that it's 1.88 meters, 1.88. I'm going to bring this up until it's around 3 meters, right? And then left click. Okay, good. So we've got that piece. And if you want to be more accurate, when I press the N key, I can use the numeric transform here to make it 3 meters exactly. So I'll say 3. We're 3 meters exactly now, the top of this thing. Okay, cool. So we've got our grid on the outside. Let's put a wall on the outside of this thing to make a sandbox. In order for us to do that, we're going to use the edge select mode. I'm going to do that by pressing Control Tab and clicking Edges. And now I'm going to select the edges around the arena that I'm making. Take a look by clicking this edge and shift right click. Again, there's a way of doing it so that you can select, you can use edge select mode. And again, the way to do that, of course, would be to, I'll do it right now. So no, I want to press there. So it's Alt and select, selects the whole edge, right? And now I'm going to rotate. And if you notice, all the way around, everything is selected, right? I'm going to press E for extrude, and I'm going to kind of push everything up. Hold on. I'm going to press the Z key to constrain it to the Z coordinate, right? So it kind of pulls everything up. I'm going to pull everything up to 3 meters approximately again. But on the right-hand side, if you notice, it says 3.027. I'm going to change this to 3. There we go. Okay, I've got my little maze, right? Take a look. I made that pretty quick, right? And I want to save this thing. Instead of it being plain, I'll save this to a maze. I'll make it a maze. I'm going to say File, Save As, and we'll call this maze.blend, and we'll save this as a Blender file. I'm not going to export the FBX because you saw the effects of the FBX. Actually, just for good measure, I will, but it doesn't matter. It won't really matter to us. I'm going to go into tab mode and use this as an object. Then I'll say File, Export, FBX, just like we normally do. And I'll call this maze.fbx. And click, make sure it's selected and click Export. Again, both ways, but the blend way is the better way for us. And I'm going to bring up Unity now. Here's my Unity, and here's my operating system. Before I do that, I might as well upload it to GitHub for you guys who are a little slower than I am. So I'm going to say git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say added maze git push origin master. And you should have the maze up on GitHub now. Okay? So if you want to follow along, you can go up on GitHub and grab those files instead of you having to make it. Now this is the key. Take a look. I'm going to import things into my models folder. Right now I got a plane. I'm going to import my maze. I'm going to go back to my operating system. I'm going to grab my maze.blend file and drag it into my models file, my models folder. When I do that, Unity does its conversion dance and makes it a maze. Okay, cool. Here's my maze. I'm going to pull this in my scene. And this is what I get. What do you think? So I've got my maze. Right? Now it looks pretty good, right? Again, I'm going to just zoom around it. Hey, I got a question for you guys. How come I can't see the walls? I can see them over here, right? But when I scroll around here, I can't see the walls. Say that again?
They're made from a plane, so they only have textures on one side.
Technically, yes. But the reason why is because it's something called back face culling, right? So unless we have to physically use it, our normals right now are pointed in a certain direction, right? And back face culling, because we never really need to see outside of the maze, right? We only need to see inside of the maze. Anything outside doesn't matter for us. What Unity does to save rendering time is to cull or not show, not render the faces that are inside the walls, right? So example, this face over here, the reason why it's not being shown, this one right here, right, is because our character controller is going to sit inside of it, right? And so we don't care what's on the other side, right? Who cares what's on the outside of our sandbox? It's irrelevant. It's another universe for us. Who cares, right? And so Unity doesn't do it. And the same thing goes for the inside walls. If I was actually going to spin this thing, I'm just going to spin this thing upside down. Take a look. You see how I don't render everything I see from the bottom because I don't care about the bottom, right? We're never going to see inside the walls of our maze, right? All we care about is the things we can see, which is up here. Okay, so we've created our maze. We've imported it into Unity. Let's add a couple things here before we continue. If you notice, I don't need an animator, so we'll fix this piece again. So my animator is going to go. We're going to remove my component. There it is. It's gone. We're using our ground. That's good, right? That's the same material that we have. If you notice, in the models, I have my own ground object. And because I've already imported the ground material from my plane, I don't have to do it again because I have my ground material here. It's the same material, right? The only thing we have to do is change it from standard to specular setup. That's it, to make it so it's not shiny. Okay, cool. Now I want to make my maze a prefab, so I'm going to drag it into my prefabs folder. Here's my maze, and now I can delete it from the scene. Okay, now if I pull it back into the scene, as an example, as a game object, it's a prefab, so I can affect it and manage it different ways. Okay, cool. So this is my maze. This is the thing that I'm going to use to start doing our game today, which is our FPS, right? Our first-person shooter. In order for us to start doing that, one more thing before we pause for a break is I'm going to add in some kind of collider, right? So there's two things that we need in the world. One is typically for a physics-based objects, we need a rigid body. But in this case, because our maze is not going to be impacted by forces, like we don't expect the whole maze to fall down or spin around or anything like that, right? We don't put a rigid body on it at all. If we put a rigid body on our maze, it'll fall. It'll literally like fall down, like as if it's an object. We don't want that to happen. So we don't need a rigid body, but we do need a collider. So I'm going to add a component, and if I go to physics, I have some options for colliders. Now here's the challenge. Because in this version of our maze, we've made our maze one big object, right? That's what we've done. We haven't made a component. We haven't made components of objects to snap together, almost like a tile-based maze. We haven't done that. Our maze is like one massive object. So because of that, if I add a box collider, it's going to box the whole maze up, right? Which means you can't collide with anything. That's not good, right? So the other collider we can use, which is a little heavier on CPU utilization for now, is the mesh collider, which creates an exact collider for us for our maze. So I'm going to click the mesh collider. I've added it in now. And we can also use some physics material if we want. For example, if we want friction, if we want to add in things like bounce and other things like that, we can create a physics material that we can add into our collider. Okay, if I want to show you what that means, I'm going to go into materials, and now we have ground. But my ground is just a regular material, right? I want to make a physics material, so I'm going to right-click and create a new physics material, right? And this physics material is going to be called ground physics, right? So we know what it is. Now, if you notice, my ground physics has a dynamic friction of 0.6, static friction of 0.6, and a bounciness of 0. I can make this thing have more of a bounciness than 0. I can also do things like combine the friction and combine the bounce and all kinds of other stuff. Let's add a slight bounce of 0.3, just so there's a bit of bounciness to the ground. And now, of course, we have to apply this physics material to my my model, right? So if I go back to my maze, I can drag and drop my ground physics onto my material where it says under mesh collider. And now my ground has this physics material built into it. Okay, let's apply this to my prefab and save my scene. My scene I haven't done yet. I'm going to save it. I'm going to save it under scenes, and we're going to call it main. And save. All right, so we've got a physics material. Physics material is what actually is called. We have our little camera. Here's our camera. But we're not going to need our camera. because as you see it after the break, our camera is actually going to be part of our it's going to be part of our controller. Let's play the scene here and see what we get so far. Well, this is what we get. This is what it looks like, right? So you actually get a bit of a room, right? This is what it looks like. We can't turn or do anything because all we're doing is our camera is fixed, but all we're getting is this scene. You get a bit of shadow casting and everything else. It looks like a realistic little room or some kind of corridor right now. Now again, we're getting the light that's coming off of the skybox, the ambient light that we're getting. We're also getting a directed light. If I want to make this dimmer, I can certainly do that by putting a roof on this thing, and we can create something that looks like more of a dungeon. Okay, let's just stop this. And for now, let's take a short break, and when we get back, I'll add in a first-person controller, and we'll get going on scripting.